Imagine one day you wake up, the sun's shining through the window, and despite only getting 4 hours of sleep, you feel completely energized and ready to take on the day. Nothing can go wrong for you today. You are the master of destiny. You take on huge tasks at work, you begin learning a new hobby or a skill, and you spend money like it's going out of style. You are on top of the world, but maybe you find yourself being a little irritable with the people around you. Your mind is going a mile a minute, and everyone else just seems slow. They're slow to catch on to your ideas, they're slow to process information or make decisions. And then out of nowhere, just a few days later, everything changes. You wake up one day after a full night's sleep, but it's a struggle to get out of bed. You feel completely exhausted. You look at your finances and feel hopeless and lost. The world seems to be falling apart all around you. Nothing is going right, and you find your mind straying into the darkest thoughts of feeling like the world would be better off without you. Mood swings are a natural part of life. But what happens when it becomes a cycle? What if these highs and lows recur almost regularly, with little windows in between where things feel like they've settled in? And amidst all of these thoughts, you realize that you don't even know who you are anymore. Are you the high-energy superstar, or the person crashing through the rocky bottom of depression? Are you somewhere in between? The truth is, you might be experiencing bipolar disorder. Ready to learn more about this difficult and complicated disorder? Stay tuned for this week's episode of Your Mind on Bipolar Disorder. Happy Thursday, everyone, and Happy New Year. I wish you all the best in 2026. If this is your first time tuning into the podcast, welcome. I'm John Shaw, and this is the Your Mind On podcast, where each week I pick a topic within the world of psychology, dig deep into the research, and share the facts of the topic. And this week, we're getting deep into bipolar disorder. Now, as we'll be discussing a psychological disorder today, I once again want to preface the episode with a couple of disclaimers. First and foremost, I am not a licensed mental health professional. I'm not offering or suggesting any kind of diagnosis, nor can I. If you feel like maybe things in this episode are hitting a little close to home, please reach out to a mental health professional. And that also brings me to the second point, one that is tricky in any medical field, and psychology is no different. It's easy to connect dots and check boxes when you read or hear information like this. Be very careful about self-diagnosing. You can lead yourself down a very dark rabbit hole for no good reason. The best option if you have any questions or thoughts is to talk to a licensed professional. There's a lot of overlap in symptoms between different disorders and conditions, so where your mind might be checking some boxes for, say, bipolar, you may actually be experiencing something totally different and less severe. So let's go ahead and get into bipolar disorder. Growing up, particularly in the late 90s, the term bipolar was widely thrown around whenever someone would get upset over something that seemed like a small thing, or whenever someone would be cheerful one minute and angry the next. I'm really thankful that this trend seems to have died out for the most part. Bipolar disorder, while not nearly as common as I once thought it was, is an incredibly difficult disorder for people to live with. But what is it exactly? The simplest definition is that bipolar disorder is a mood disorder where the person experiences periods of extreme highs, or mania, followed by periods of extreme depression. Now, just from that definition, it can be easy for someone to immediately self-diagnose or to internally diagnose someone around them as having this disorder. But it's a bit more extreme than just happy one minute and sad the next. In terms of bipolar disorder, mania and depression are pretty extreme. Mania is defined as a highly energized state characterized by elation or irritability, decreased need for sleep, racing thoughts, excessive confidence, increased energy, and engagement in reward-oriented behaviors without considering negative consequences. A manic episode must last at least 1 week or require hospitalization. The depressive state is defined as the state characterized by a deflated, withdrawn, morose mood, often accompanied by suicidal ideation. In order for an official diagnosis, both mania and depression must be present and must last for more than a short time. Like most diagnoses in psychology, bipolar disorder has gone through changes throughout the years. It has been well documented throughout history, often described in old texts as periods of melancholy and mania. In the 19th century, 2 French psychiatrists, Jean-Pierre Fauret and Jules Baillarger, proposed that mania and depression were not always 2 separate conditions, but were rather 2 states of cycling mood disorder. In 1850, Fauret introduced the concept of circular insanity, characterizing it as a continuous cycle of depression and mania punctuated by free intervals of varying lengths where the patient could function normally. In 1854, Baillarger presented his own description of the illness to the French Imperial Académie Nationale de Médecine, which he called madness in double form. While both Fauret and Baillarger were describing the same condition, they did not exactly agree on everything. The main difference between their 2 models is the free intervals between episodes. Fauret's model included those who experienced a long interval between mood states, whereas Baillarger argued that mania and melancholia could change directly into one another with no requirement for a pause or free interval. This disagreement created a rift in psychiatric understanding at the time, although modern analysis suggests that they are essentially describing 2 sides of the same coin. Fauret is specifically recognized as the first physician to categorize these severe mood swings as a single, separate psychiatric disorder rather than separate conditions. These French medical breakthroughs provided the basis for the current conceptualization of the bipolar illness. Their work was eventually unified and expanded upon by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who used their descriptions of episodic mood dysfunction to build the comprehensive diagnosis of manic-depressive insanity. In the 1950s and 60s, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, or DSM, editions 1 and 2 were released, with the disorder being listed as manic-depressive illness. Later, in 1980, the DSM-3 was released, and a major shift occurred with the introduction of the term bipolar disorder. This change emphasized polarity, or the presence of mania, over episodicity and formally separated unipolar from bipolar depression. Under the description in the DSM-4, a mixed episode was its own diagnostic category. To meet this criteria, an individual had to satisfy the full requirements for both manic episode and a major depressive episode, with the exception of duration, nearly every day for a period of at least 1 week. This state often involved rapid shifts between anger, euphoria, and despair, sometimes lasting only moments or even hours. The next big shift for the disorder happened when the DSM-5 was released. The mixed episode language was removed as a separate category and replaced with mixed features specifier. This allows for the characterization of depressive symptoms during a manic or hypomanic episode, or manic hypomanic symptoms during a depressive episode, reflecting the clinical reality that mood states are often not pure. This evolution has been criticized by some who advocate for the return of the more dimensional bipolar spectrum approach. This view, hearkening back to Kraepelin, posits that mood dysfunctions exist on a continuum rather than in discrete categories. This model includes broader classifications such as bipolar 1, 2, 3, and 4 that capture presentations like antidepressant-induced hypomania, which would increase the estimated prevalence to 4 to 5% of the general population. So if broadening the definition to this more dimensional bipolar spectrum would increase the prevalence to 4 to 5% of the general population, what is the prevalence of the disorder now? Well, the worldwide prevalence of bipolar disorder is estimated to be around 1.06 to 1.56% of the population, with the prevalence in the United States being around 1% as estimated by the Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense guidelines, while the National Institute of Mental Health lists the prevalence as being 2.8%. Bipolar disorder is generally broken down into two subgroups, along with a subgroup that is somewhat outside of the diagnosis. First, there's bipolar 1 disorder, and this is when someone has at least one major lifetime manic episode accompanied by depressive episodes. However, the manic episode doesn't specifically have to last for one full week if the symptoms are severe enough to require psychiatric hospitalization. And then there's bipolar 2 disorder, which is defined by the presence of less severe hypomanic episodes, lasting at least 4 days and not causing any marked impairment, along with major depressive episodes. When someone doesn't exactly meet the criteria for bipolar 1 or 2, but experiences recurring high and low states, they may be diagnosed with cyclothymic disorder. In order to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it isn't just about mood swings, but rather about the severity of the mood swings. The symptoms must cause a noticeable impairment in someone's ability to work, socialize, or maintain relationships. There may also be psychotic features that can lead to the diagnosis as well, including delusions of grandiosity or a special relationship with God, and even hallucinations. When someone has bipolar disorder but has not yet been diagnosed, they typically don't feel like they have a medical condition, but rather they feel like they have a volatile personality or a life that keeps falling apart for no reason. Because they lack the vocabulary of mania or hypomania, they often interpret their symptoms as character strengths or personal failures. Before being diagnosed, people living with the disorder see the highs as the real me. They might go through weeks where they only need 4 hours of sleep. They feel witty, incredibly productive, and physically vibrant. They might start 3 new businesses, deep clean the entire house at 3 a.m., or spend $2,000 on a new hobby that they've never even tried before. They often feel that everyone else just moves too slowly in life as they are a high-energy person. They are often unintentionally abrasive, talking over people and making impulsive decisions like quitting a job or ending a relationship because they feel invincible. But this period doesn't last. Their mood crashes, and when the crash happens, it feels like a moral failing or a mysterious physical illness rather than a clinical episode. Suddenly, the superhuman version of themselves vanishes. Simple tasks like brushing teeth or answering a text feel like climbing Mount Everest. They might sleep for 14 hours and still feel exhausted. This is often accompanied by thoughts like, "I'm a fraud. I was so productive last month, and now I'm just lazy. I must have been faking it." Friends and family are usually pretty confused. And they'll ask, where did that high-energy person go? And then this leads to deep shame and even social withdrawal. Without a diagnosis, life often looks like a series of restarts. They might have a resume full of jobs that they started with passion but mysteriously lost interest in or quit during a manic outburst. Financially, they may go through a cycle of boom and bust. For example, they might save money during stable periods only to drain their accounts completely during an undiagnosed manic episode. In relationships, partners often describe it as walking on eggshells. One week they're the most romantic, engaged partner on earth, and the next they're irritable, cold, or entirely absent. Perhaps the most confusing part of being undiagnosed is the mixed episode. This is having the energy of mania with the darkness of depression. It's an agitated depression. They feel wired but tired. This is often when people are most at risk for self-harm because they have the depressive thoughts, but unlike a standard depression, they actually have the physical energy to act on them. Before diagnosis, it's common for someone with bipolar disorder to struggle with their sense of identity. When there is such a volatile shift from the highs to the lows, with some time spent in between, they often have a hard time pinning down which version of them is the real version. Are they the super high energy person? Are they the depressed, withdrawn person? A mixture of the two? In a way, living undiagnosed is like being a passenger in a car where someone else is slamming on the gas and then the brakes, but you're the one who gets the speeding ticket and the blame for crashes. Besides manic and depressive episodes, there are other key hallmarks of the bipolar disorder. Sleep and circadian rhythm are one of these. A reduced need for sleep is a diagnostic criterion for mania, with 69 to 99% of individuals reporting it. Bipolar depression is characterized by either hypersomnia, excessive sleepiness, 38 to 78% of patients report this, or severe insomnia. Sleep disturbance is the most commonly reported early warning sign for a manic episode. A widely accepted explanation posits that sleep problems in bipolar disorder result from dysregulated circadian rhythms, or the body's internal 24-hour biological clock. Individuals with bipolar disorder are thought to have weakly entrained systems supported by findings of abnormal melatonin and cortisol secretion patterns. The social Zeitgeber theory proposes that disruptions in social routines such as sleep schedules, meal times, and social interactions, known as Zeitgebers or time givers, can destabilize these fragile biological rhythms, leading to the onset of mood episodes. Essentially, if someone with bipolar disorder has a routine of eating dinner at a particular time every day and going to bed at a certain time, and that gets interrupted, maybe they have to eat dinner an hour later than usual or aren't able to go to bed at their usual time, this can actually induce a mood episode. Another hallmark of bipolar disorder is one that is much more surprising for most people. There is a substantial body of literature and biographical accounts suggesting a strong association between bipolar disorder and creative accomplishment. Biographical studies are the most common approach involving reviewing biographical materials of eminent individuals. These studies consistently find elevated rates of bipolar disorder symptoms among famous artists, writers, and musicians, including figures like Ernest Hemingway, Vincent van Gogh, Virginia Woolf, and Robert Schumann. Direct assessments using structured interviews and questionnaires confirm these findings. In one study of writers at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop, 43% met criteria for bipolar spectrum disorders compared to 10% of a control group. Individuals with bipolar disorder are more likely to choose creative occupations. An analysis of the epidemiological catchment area study found that those with bipolar 1 had significantly higher occupational creativity scores than those with no diagnosis. Similarly, subsyndromal manic traits measured by the hypomanic personality scale correlate with greater engagement in daily creative activities. However, it has also been noticed that the more severe the disorder is for someone, the less this holds true. People with bipolar 2 and cyclothymia had higher creative accomplishment scores than both healthy controls and individuals with bipolar 1 disorder, whose scores did not differ from controls. And maybe the most interesting aspect here is that individuals in remission do not typically show elevated scores on creativity tests like the Torrance tests of creative thinking. In fact, research suggests deficits in cognitive shifting, which could impair flexibility. This discrepancy suggests that creativity in bipolar disorder may be more state-dependent than stable trait, driven by intermittent bouts of creative thought tied to mood variability. There are a few factors that are proposed to explain the connection. First is personality and motivation. Bipolar disorder and risk for it are associated with traits that foster creativity, including openness to experience, impulsivity, ambition, and drive. Individuals prone to mania endorse extremely elevated lifetime ambitions for fame and success, which may provide the fuel to persevere toward difficult creative goals. And second is affective states. Mildly positive mood states enhance cognitive flexibility. Individuals with bipolar disorder often believe their creativity is heightened during periods of high mood and energy. Case studies like Robert Schumann, for example, show increased productivity during manic periods. However, severe mania with symptoms like poor judgment and hypersexuality is seen as detrimental. Research consistently finds no link between depression or negative affect and enhanced creativity. Now, once a person is diagnosed as having bipolar disorder, things don't get any easier. The process of receiving a diagnosis is often long and filled with uncertainty, taking sometimes years and multiple doctors. The final diagnosis can bring a sense of relief and self-understanding, providing a framework for past behaviors. However, it is also frequently accompanied by a grieving process for the life a person thought they would have, involving stages of denial, anger, and despair. The diagnosis presents a major challenge to one's sense of self. Individuals engage in a process of protecting their pre-diagnosis identity before eventually restructuring their identity to incorporate the illness. Some participants report positive outcomes, such as gaining insight, compassion, and a desire to help others. Relationships are often negatively affected. This can lead to social withdrawal as individuals try to protect family and friends from the impact of their symptoms. Others may react to the diagnosis with fear or anxiety. As a result, individuals with bipolar disorder report having fewer close friends and often must renegotiate relationships. Despite the challenges, developing positive social support is the desired goal. Strong support systems are associated with fewer mood symptoms and better functioning. But aside from strong support systems, what are some treatments for people experiencing bipolar disorders? Effective management of bipolar disorder relies on a combination of medication and psychosocial interventions. When we look at medicine, the gold standard mood stabilizer, lithium, has been noted as having a 70% positive response rate. Lithium is also noted for providing protection against suicidal ideation. Quetiapine is noted by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense guidelines as an effective medication for all phases of bipolar disorder, acute mania, acute depression, and maintenance therapy. Anticonvulsants such as valproate and lamotrigine show effectiveness in 60 to 65% of patients. Antidepressant monotherapy is cautioned against as it can actually trigger manic episodes in up to 25% of bipolar patients. Psychotherapy, when added to medication, is highly beneficial for patients who are not acutely manic. Some of the methods most frequently used are family-focused therapy, or FFT, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, IPSRT, and even electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Family-focused therapy is a psychoeducational intervention involving the patient and family members. It focuses on communication, problem solving, and developing relapse prevention plans. Randomized trials have shown that FFT significantly improves mood symptoms and reduces rehospitalization rates compared to medication alone. Cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy can reduce episode frequency by 40% when combined with medication management. Interpersonal and social rhythm therapy focuses on helping patients regulate their daily routines and sleep-wake cycles, directly addressing the circadian disruptions inherent in the disorder. And electroconvulsive therapy is an effective option for severe treatment-resistant cases with remission rates of 80 to 90%. However, this is reserved for extremely severe cases and is only done with consent from the patient and family, unlike historical cases of ECT where patients were essentially strapped down and forced to receive the therapy. There are also a number of recommended reasonable accommodations that are recommended for employers to provide someone with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. Because bipolar disorder can have huge impacts on someone's ability to work, employers are recommended to make some adjustments to the work conditions that will allow someone with bipolar disorder to function better and be more productive. These suggested accommodations are broken down by symptoms or areas of limitations to directly address those. For maintaining stamina, employers might provide more flexible scheduling, more frequent breaks, a self-paced workload, or options for part-time or even work-from-home schedules. For maintaining concentration, reduce distractions through the use of a private office or sound machines like white noise machines, allow for an uninterrupted work time, and divide large assignments into smaller tasks. Use day-to-day to-do lists and calendars, provide electronic organizers, and reminding employees of important deadlines can help with organization and deadlines. For handling stress and emotions, provide praise and positive reinforcement, referrals to the employee assistance programs, allow calls to social support networks when needed, and provide sensitivity training to coworkers. To improve attendance issues in someone with bipolar disorder, employers should consider flexible schedules, allow missed work time to be made up, and allow for an option to work from home. Among all of the treatments and therapies for bipolar disorder, one of the most important aspects is the role of the family environment, particularly through the attitudes and behaviors of relatives toward a family member with a psychiatric disorder, categorized as high or low. This is known as expressed emotion, or EE. High EE is typically a problem in the family dynamics involving bipolar disorder. High EE is characterized by high levels of criticism, hostility, or emotional over-involvement, and is a robust predictor of relapse for patients with bipolar disorder. High EE relatives are more likely to attribute a patient's negative behaviors to controllable factors like personality or lack of effort rather than to the illness. High EE attitudes may develop through a recursive cycle where a child's temperamental vulnerability, such as irritability or mood instability, interacts with a parent's reactive style, like frustration or anxiety, fueling a cycle of negative interaction that contributes to the child's emotional dysregulation and the parent's high EE attitudes. Bipolar disorder is not a new phenomenon by any means. It has been well documented in historical accounts, especially of those creative geniuses that are still well known today, and it is extremely complex and complicated. On the surface, It can be a severely debilitating disorder that can have negative impacts on everything from finances to employment to relationships, and should receive proper treatment. However, it's important to note the creative aspects of patients with bipolar disorder, and that treatment could result in lower creativity, even eliminating the creative genius in some people. As I mentioned, Vincent van Gogh, according to biographical studies, showed a lot of signs and symptoms of bipolar disorder. What would have happened if he had received modern treatments for the disorder? Would he still have painted as many beautiful works of art that we know and appreciate today? At what point do we as a society draw the line between diagnosing and treating a psychological disorder and allowing someone the freedom to experience their lives through the lens of their disorder to allow for that creativity, essentially enabling the tortured artist stereotype? Well, that, I suppose, is a trick question. We as a society do not get to draw that line. That is for the individual to decide. They have the choice to continue on with the volatile mood swings, unstable relationships, depression, and possibly the risk of suicide, or seek diagnosis and treatment at the potential cost of their creative abilities. Living with someone with bipolar disorder, whether it's a family member, friend, spouse, or employee, is not easy. It requires understanding the disorder and how it affects the individual. It requires making adjustments to your own way of thinking. It can be easy to see their behavior as eccentric and that they just need to quit acting out, but it is a disorder. It is not something that they can just decide to change in their personality. It requires patience and understanding. It requires making some accommodations to help them manage life, whether they're in treatment or not. It's definitely more difficult if they're not receiving treatment and therapy for the disorder, as it becomes a task of determining what state the person is currently in and how to interact with them in that state. For patients that are receiving therapy and treatment, being understanding and accommodating is essential. Being overly critical, hostile, or over-involving yourself in their emotional states can actually cause the person to relapse into mood episodes. It's not uncommon for relationships to fall apart after a diagnosis, as people often feel fear about the diagnosis or are overwhelmed by the difficulty of managing that relationship. The key thing to understand here is that while you should always look out for your own health and well-being, either physically or emotionally, abruptly leaving a relationship with someone with bipolar disorder can be devastating to their recovery and treatment and could trigger a depressive mood episode. Now, rest assured, I'm not saying that should you find yourself in some form of relationship with someone that's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, that you should stick around for their sake. Instead, where I'm going with this is that you shouldn't just abruptly leave the relationship. It needs to be a deep conversation. And during that conversation, rather than saying that their disorder is too much for you to handle, some sort of rephrasing to, "I'm not strong enough to help you through this," can really help, because it refocuses the blame away from their disorder to the idea of not being able to help. Depending on how severe their shifts are, this might also need to be done along with a therapist who's there to help moderate. Of course, there are caveats here, as there are with any other aspect of life. Obviously, if there is a pattern of abuse, you have to think of your own health and well-being first and foremost. But if the relationship, whether it's with a spouse, parent, supervisor, boss, child, is generally a good one that should continue, be mindful of what bipolar disorder is and how it shows itself. Be patient with them and with yourself. A lot of what someone with bipolar needs may be counter to what you need, and you just have to learn balance. So, at the end of the day, bipolar disorder is so much more than just mood swings. It's a complex cycle that can make someone feel like a passenger in their own life, especially before they have the right words or diagnosis to explain what's happening. Whether it's the intense creative outbursts or the crushing lows. This is a condition that requires a lot of grace, both from the person living with it and from the people around them. We've seen how far we've come from early theories of circular insanity to modern treatments that actually work, but the most important thing to remember is that the diagnosis isn't an end. It's a starting point for a more stable and understood life. Thanks for sticking with me today as we dove into the highs and lows. Don't forget to leave a rating on the podcast if you've enjoyed following along and learning with me today. Ratings really help the podcast show up in searches, which helps draw in more listeners, and that in turn leads to much more content and better content in the future. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at YourMindOnPodcast. And if you have questions, comments, or future topic suggestions, you can email the show at hello@yourmindonpodcast.com. And you can also visit our website, www.yourmindonpodcast.com, to learn more about the show, stream episodes, and learn more about me. And as usual, the links will be in the show notes, so you can find those easily. Next week, we will once again look at a well-known and highly controversial psychological study. This time, we'll be looking at the Stanford prison experiment. At the time, the results were shocking, and it was again brought into the public conversation around 2005 when the details of the treatments of the prisoners at the Iraq prison Abu Ghraib being made public, specifically because of the uncanny mirroring of the experiment to what occurred at the prison. Further digging and research on the study have also led to questions about the validity of the experiment as a whole. So what did the experiment teach us compared to what it was supposed to teach? How does it impact life today in the balance of power within the prison system and other positions of power, such as leadership? And with the thought that the entire experiment was flawed from the start, is this study even relevant today? Join me next week as we explore the study in depth. Once again, thank you for listening today. I'm John Shaw, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step to changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.